Hey, it's Carrie Joe.
Hey, it's Anna. Join us as we learn new things, challenge our assumptions, and grow as people. Welcome to the Heretical Hippies podcast.
In this season, we are going to explore the intersection of curiosity and wonder, and hopefully develop some fresh ways to see the world and ourselves. So come along for the ride, or don't. Either way, we're going to hit record.
Welcome, listeners, to the Heretical Hippies podcast. Today, Carrie Joe and I are talking about creation myths. Hi, Carrie Joe.
Hey, Anna. I'm super excited about this topic.
I know. I was just about to say the same thing. Yeah, we've done a lot of studying in the last few weeks to get prepared for this. And I want to preface with, there's nothing new. We're not sharing anything new in the grand scheme of things. We are not scholars, and please do your own research. So if anything we share inspires you or makes you think or have a question, go look it up, because it's possible, there might be some things that we share that we don't get completely right. And this is a complicated subject. It's a very complicated subject. I found conflicting information all over the place.
Yeah.
You'd look for something specific, and then this website would say it's one thing and this other website would say another. And so it's a very broad and varied perspective. Let's define myth first.
Okay.
If you don't mind.
What did you find? I'm going to share what I found too, because maybe those conflict with each other. That'd be interesting.
Sure. Oh, yeah, it's possible. But yeah, and I think that people's understandings of myths definitely varies, you know? So to me, it's always just been, or my research that I gathered, a traditional story rooted in ancient cultures and civilizations, that has a moral lesson. And it usually helps define the culture or how they came about or where they're from, things like that. And what the natural world, why it is the way it is, the unknowns in the natural world. So it's really kind of like a myth to attempts to define everything that we have questions about in our existential dilemmas.
Yeah, that's actually really similar to the one I found. Actually, I listened to a podcast. We're going to put all these resources in the show notes. So I'm sharing this here, but if you're interested, you can search up the podcast at the bottom of our podcast thing. But he had two definitions of a myth, and one was very similar to yours, Anna. It's a well thought out story that ages well, that somebody came up with, some culture came up with to make sense of their place in the world, the environment that they find themselves in. And the second one was, which he had a little beef with, so I'll just preface that. He said the second definition of a myth is a story waiting for science to debunk it, like a magical story that's all made up. Mm-hmm. So that would be the more pessimistic side, or pessimistic way to view a myth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, we found pretty similar definitions.
Yeah. So we started off with this journey of deep dive of creation myths with okay, well, we were raised with the Genesis story. I feel like every time I read the Genesis story with new wisdom, I see it understanding and wisdom about archaeology and about linguistics. I come to it with a whole new perspective almost every time I read it, So I know Carrie Joe and I both discovered that there's two different creation myths in Genesis, and they're actually right next to each other, but most people, and us included, have read those stories as one story our entire lives. So Carrie Joe, what'd you learn about that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to say this for anyone else who might feel sheepish finding this out. I was flabbergasted when I learned that there were not only two creation stories, but two creation stories that conflict with each other. Because, like you said, they're right back to back. And so I always read it as if it was a continuation, or maybe a little different verbiage used to describe it. And there are clear discrepancies. And so I'm not going to read the entire story, the 1 and 2 stories, because you've probably heard it a million times, and if not, you can look it up. But what I discovered is Genesis 1, it's a very structured creation, right? You have all the 6 days of creation, the 7th day was for rest. So it's a very orderly fashion over the span of 6 days. I thought this was interesting. The word used for God was Adonai Elohim, which is a more general term, which sets God up as more removed from humankind. So a little more sterile depiction of God. God creates through the spoken word. And then, this is important, plants were created on day 3. Humans were created on day 6. And that was the let us create them in our image. That's that verse. So there's no differentiation between man and woman. It was just humans were created at the same time. So the second one, I forgot to say, that one is Genesis 1. The
first chapter, you mean?
Correct, yes. And it actually goes into like verse 3 of chapter 2. It's like they got the stop points on the chapter. It's kind of weird, but in Genesis 2, it focuses on the creation of humans and the Garden of Eden. So it's like a little different angle. And I think that's why I always dismissed it as like, oh, it's just like another take on it. Like somebody else saw it and reported on it.
Like they're zooming in now and just talking about the 2 first humans that were created.
Right. But it's kind of interesting, the stuff that I found. So in Genesis 2, the creation story, Yahweh Elohim is the word used to name God, which actually signifies a closer relationship with humans, because you'll see in this story that, I mean, God is like down in the dirt, literally creating man out of dust. And so I thought that was interesting too. I'm going to come back to why it is that way. Okay, so God creates humans in this account. God creates humans first, then plants a garden. So it goes man, plants, animals, and there's no mention of sea creatures. And then woman is created from man. So very lastly. Okay, now the reason that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 have a different vibes to it is because Genesis 1 is a priestly version. And it's like, by scholars, it's considered to be kind of the story that is from ancient times. At the time of this writing, they were trying to kind of bring in all of the gathered myth information that they had up to that point to kind of set up where they're coming from and then where they've landed on their version of the creation myth, which is then Genesis 2. I hope you guys are following. It's like a lot of bouncing around. Yeah. But the Genesis 2 creation story is called the Yahweh version. And I can't go into exactly why, like specifically, but what I found was the second chapter in Genesis, that creation version, they felt like that was more representative of where they were at, like thinking wise, like theologically, ideologically. And I gotta say, Anna, you know I gotta hit the misogyny. This is very interesting. So most people are familiar with the day 1 through 7. Right? That's typically what is taught in churches and Sunday school, all that jazz. But most people also have heard the woman is made from the rib of Adam.
Right.
And so woman comes after Adam.
Right.
And that is where the little dash of misogyny has to be thrown in there. And I mean, it makes sense though, because these stories were written by men. They were probably passed down orally by men as well. And, you know, like whoever's in power, they're going to have their slant on it. So, of course, why wouldn't they want woman to be created from them? So I just thought that was kind of interesting. And like, I'm sure you can find podcasts and articles, whatever, like all the Patreon blog post stuff that somebody has dove into the misogyny and how it comes out through scripture.
Oh, but sure.
I just scratched the surface, but I just like the beef I have with the patriarchal system. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I found. Did I miss covering anything that you?
No, I'm sure you did, but it doesn't matter because we're not scholars. So
No, we're not.
hopefully that will wet your whistle enough to make you want to go research this on your own, because believe me, there's plenty of information out there about it. The scholars and the linguists, I mean, for the most part, don't really disagree that there are two clear creation myths in Genesis.
Yeah, and written at
And
different times.
yes, oh,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then the names for God too, like that is and not just the names for God, which indicate the differences, but also this, like you said, the stories are different. The language that's used in the original Hebrews that we have, which is not the originals, it's just what we have, but in the oldest texts we have of the creation stories are different. It's just like, all in all, like it's kind of like an obvious, oh yeah, but it's been put together for us like it isn't. And it definitely feels like I feel like a little bit deceived here.
Oh, absolutely.
You know?
I was just thinking, I felt duped when I found that out. I was like,
Yeah.
you're kidding me. I was a
Right.
good little Christian. Like, I studied the scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're told that, air quotes, this is the creation story,
Mm-hmm.
and then they spew off the various accounts, mostly chapter 1 and a little dash of misogyny from chapter 2, then that's what you're going to believe. And when you read it, that's what you're going to see.
Yeah.
So, yeah, hopefully we can remove some of those filters from people's eyes when we hear about, especially the Genesis creation stories, because I know some people are coming to this podcast believing that the scriptures are the spoken word of God, or maybe not spoken, but at least kind of downloaded word of God to humans. And there, it's fallible, it's inerrant. That's where I was probably 2-3 years ago. But you have to suspend that just for a moment, just to have a critical eye or ear in this case when you're learning about these things, because it's really easy to be dismissive and be like, oh, well, I just think they're just spewing stuff because they're mad at Christianity. No, like, we're not actually. We just think it's like fascinating that nobody ever told us this. So we want to be the ones to kind of open eyes, to share some information with you that might lead you on your own quest for deeper truth. So yeah, I feel like that's kind of the attitude we're coming at this with. We're not trying to like burst anybody's bubble or anything like that, but we want to expose people to things that we wish we were exposed to.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think when I first started, I mean, the internet obviously is what has helped us so much in understanding more about the research that's been done on scripture. And, I mean, I realized in my own studies that I was not getting the answers I wanted. And so I started looking to scholars who've been dedicated 30, 40, 50 years to trying to understand the languages that these were written in, and then combining all of their information with other scholars to contrast and compare. And that kind of work, I don't have lifetimes to do it, And so I am putting a lot of trust in all the research that's been done for a long time now. And it was not hard to see that I have not been educated the best I could be in the origins of scripture, and really what is the deeper and broader perspectives within what it's trying to say, or what we think it's trying to say, So as you and I researched further, we delved into other creation myths to try to broaden our perspectives about what people from around the world have believed about where we came from. So I'm going to share one, which I think there's so many I wrote down. So I'm trying to decide. I'll do a Native American one because I'll stick to home first, and then we'll broad out and go out to Mesopotamia. But the Chippewa Nation is a Native American group, and I'm going to give you a brief description of their creation story. In the beginning, there was water and spirit world. Spirit created the first human being, or the first being, who was tasked with creating the world. His name was Nanabozo. Nanabozo dove into the primordial waters and brought up a handful of earth, which was used to create the land. Then he created the animals, the lakes, and the rivers, and finally created humans, the Anishinaabe, and that's what they called them, and taught them how to live in harmony with the natural world. So this story supposedly dates back 2,000 to 3,000 years at a similar time that the creation stories were being perpetuated in Israel and the surrounding areas, Mesopotamia. And it's so interesting to me that this reoccurring theme, that this motif, as they call it, the primordial waters, is everywhere.
Yeah, I found
Everywhere.
several as well with that theme.
Yeah, I mean, Papua New Guinea, South America, North America, probably every continent on the earth had what they refer to as the primordial waters, which is like the waters that never end, like the enormous, vast, eternal water, which is so, so interesting to me. And keep your ears and eyes open for that if you're listening, because I think that it's, to me, I did not realize this, but I learned that there's an emerging field of study that explores the spiritual and theological significance of water in various cultures and traditions. It's called hydrotheology.
Oh, I love that so much.
Isn't that
neat?
My
gosh, I love that.
I just thought that was so cool because I'm sure everybody, I love to swim. Water is one of my places on earth that I feel like I feel most at peace and at ease. And so when I heard that, I was like, I need to look into hydrotheology, because I think that, and have you ever seen that video? I mean, there's a few of them out now, but of a guy that basically says, what if God is water?
I probably have.
Okay, I'll have to share the link for that too. There's like
Yeah.
a link list we need to start keeping, because there's so many different links. But yeah, he actually tries to build a really interesting case for why he thinks God is water. And so anyway, you can deep dive on your own on that one. What are your thoughts, Carrie Jo?
Yeah, well, okay, this is very interesting because you and I both agreed to share some sort of creation myth that resonated with us.
Right.
Yeah, do you want me to share mine now?
Please, go ahead.
Because the reason I ask is because there is a ton of overlap in the one I chose. And also, sidebar, do you know the region that the Chippewas inhabited? Was it the Great Lakes region?
That's a good question. I'll look it up while you're reading.
Okay, the only reason I think that is because there are like several schools in Michigan that the Chippewas are like their mascot, which we don't need to get into that political issue there. But yeah, so the story I am sharing, it's from a people that were from the Great Lakes region. So, and
interesting.
For whatever reason, I can't remember the tribe. Maybe
Northern United States, Southern Canada.
Okay, so yeah, regionally, that makes sense.
Great Lakes region.
Oh, there you go. Okay,
Yeah.
so this is why there's so much overlap. But okay, also listen for similarities to the creation stories in Genesis as well, because I underlined all the things that I thought were related, which were very interesting. Okay, so this is really poetic, and I don't want to cheapen it by paraphrasing, so I'm actually going to read it because it's really beautiful. And if you're listening to this on twice the speed, you might want to slow it down, because I'm going to try to read quickly so we don't spend a ton of time on it. Okay, it is called this is Sky Woman. She fell like a maple seed, pirouetting on an autumn breeze. A column of light streamed from a hole in the sky world, marking her path where only darkness had been before. It took her a long time to fall. In fear, or maybe hope, she clutched a bundle tightly in her hand. Hurtling downward, she saw only dark water below. But in that emptiness, there were many eyes gazing up at the sudden shaft of light. They saw there a small object, a mere dust mote in the beam. As it grew closer, they could see that it was a woman, arms outstretched, long black hair billowing behind as she spiraled toward them. The geese nodded at one another and rose together from the water in a wave of goose music. She felt the beat of their wings as they flew beneath to break her fall. Far from the only home she'd ever known, she caught her breath at the warm embrace of soft feathers as they gently carried her downward, and so it began. The geese could not hold the woman above the water for much longer, so they called a council to decide what to do. Resting on their wings, she saw them all gather, loons, otters, swans, beavers, fish of all kinds. A great turtle floated in their midst and offered his back for her to rest upon. Gratefully, she stepped from the goose wings onto the dome of his shell. The others understood that she needed land for her home and discussed how they might serve her need. The deep divers among them had heard of mud at the bottom of the water and agreed to go find some. Loon dove first, but the distance was too far, and after a long while he surfaced with nothing to show for his efforts. One by one, the other animals offered to help: otter, beaver, sturgeon. But the depth, the darkness, and the pressures were too great for even the strongest of swimmers. They returned, gasping for air with their heads ringing. Some did not return at all. Soon, only little muskrat was left, the weakest diver of all. He volunteered to go while the others looked on doubtfully. His small legs flailed as he worked his way downward, and he was gone a very long time. They waited and waited for him to return, fearing the worst for their relative, and before long a stream of bubbles rose with the small, limp body of the muskrat. He had given his life to aid this helpless human. But then the others noticed that his paw was tightly clenched, and when they opened it, there was a small handful of mud. Turtle said, "Here, put it on my back, and I will hold it." Sky Woman bent and spread the mud with her hands across the shell of the turtle. Moved by the extraordinary gifts of the animals, she sang in thanksgiving and then began to dance, her feet caressing the earth. The land grew and grew as she danced her thanks, from the dab of mud on Turtle's back until the whole earth was made. Not by Sky Woman alone, but from the alchemy of all the animals' gifts coupled with her deep gratitude. Together they formed what we know today as Turtle Island, our home. Like any good guest, Sky Woman had not come empty-handed. The bundle was still clutched in her hand. When she toppled from the hole in the sky world, she had reached out to grab onto the tree of life that grew there. In her grasp were branches, fruits, and seeds of all kinds of plants. These she scattered onto the new ground and carefully tended each one until the world turned from brown to green. Sunlight streamed through the hole from the sky world, allowing the seeds to flourish. Wild grasses, flowers, trees, and medicines spread everywhere, and now that the animals, too, had plenty to eat, many came to live with her on Turtle Island. That is an excerpt from the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Excellent book, if you're interested. I wish I knew which tribe she's from off the top of my head. I do not. I believe she is Potawatomi, but I'm not sure that myth is from her specific culture. So I don't want to get that wrong. I would love to hear your thoughts on that, Anna.
Yeah. Well, first thing, I'm looking for similarities to what I see in other cultures, stories. And first of all, the Sky Woman is clearly something that comes from the sky. In a lot of these stories, the main character is from heaven or another place and has come down to the water or the chaos to do something. And then deep divers is another common theme I'm seeing in a lot of stories. Like there is, like kind of like in my story too, like went into the ocean and then pulled back up the earth, in a similar way as this story as well. And then the animals communicating with the humans. That's something you don't see in every story, but I notice in more indigenous stories, like in the broader scoped pantheon of gods stories from Mesopotamia, don't really talk a lot about animals on their own having their own personalities and interaction with humans. Like they talk about animals, but I find that in the indigenous cultures, there's definitely more of a connection, like a more grounded, seemingly perspective of being connected with the environment.
That's definitely true. And that's something that I also read in this book that I mentioned, the Braiding Sweetgrass, is that she said that the tribes she is familiar with, they personify trees, plants, like they talk to them, they engage with them as if they have their own individual spirits. And so that tracks completely with what you're saying. And I think that's a really beautiful way to exist. It really increases the amount of respect you have and you give to creation instead of just seeing it as something to subdue, as Christians are taught, we are told to subdue the earth. And that's is such a colonizing way of looking at things, which, I mean, the interconnectedness of all this is fascinating to me.
And you can go so many different directions and you do have to, in a lot of ways, make assumptions about so much to be able to, and so that we will be doing that. We make our own assumptions. That's just part of who we are as humans. We're going to take all this in and regurgitate it from a subjective point of view, right? But it is true. It's like, I feel like the cultures that had the broader, more dynamic, and like I said, more pantheon of gods, like rather than a simple story like what you just shared, tend to have more influence and a broader control motive, than these cultures that have the earth was created with animals and a bird woman.
Yeah.
Like there's no obvious like underlying like power struggle going on there. It's just a simple story.
Right. It doesn't seem to have ulterior motives in any way, shape,
Right.
or form. Can't speak for their hearts, but on surface, it doesn't look that way.
Exactly. So there's so many stories that I wanted to share, and I feel like the next one I need to share would probably be one that I should share after what you're going to share. So I'd love to hear the Mesopotamian story that on the other side of the spectrum, because I think it's great that we both shared an indigenous creation myth. I think we should switch to the Mesopotamian and see what we came up with.
Okay. One thing that I found that was very interesting, that clearly, historically, scholars believe this to be true, influenced the stories in Genesis. So it's called the Enuma Elisha. I'm not sure exactly how that's supposed to be said. It is from the Middle East, and it has a lot of overlap with Genesis. And I'll share the overlaps, and I'll share the differences that I found. There's watery chaos before creation in both of them. There is separation of the chaos into heaven and earth. There are different types of water that are separated. So, salt and fresh. That was the thing that was in the Enuma Elisha, whereas, in Genesis, it's the waters above from the waters below, which could be, I guess it could be argued the waters above are fresh, the waters below are salty. And then the number of tablets that this was written on, the Enuma Elisha, was 7. And there's some speculation amongst scholars that that's why there are 7 days of creation. Yeah, so I found that to be very interesting.
So can you pause for a second?
Yeah.
The Enuma Elisha, Enuma Elisha, right?
Correct.
And what region specifically was this from, and how old were the tablets? Do you know?
It's just the source I have. Like again, I didn't deep dive into this because I only had so much time. It was stated as the Middle East.
So I think it's Babylon.
Oh, yeah, the tablets. Yes, absolutely. You are right. Yeah, you're correct. I do not know actually, it says southern Iraq is where this was quoted from, but I think it was in surrounding areas as well.
Yeah, Sumeria, Babylon is kind of like general region of modern day Iraq.
Okay, there you go. So that's the geographical context. The time frame, I didn't write that down.
No, that's fine. I'm gonna look it up while you're telling us the story. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm actually not gonna go into the story.
Okay,
I don't know that we have the time for that, but if that interests you, I would really look it up because I listened about it on a podcast, and I also was reading on it, just like Google search, and it's really incredible because in all those things that I was reading and listening to, they were stating that scholars are, I don't want to say 100%, they're never 100%, but they are like confident that this story, this epic, this myth was used to influence the Genesis stories.
Yeah.
And I think that actually brings me to an offshoot, a path that I want to share. For one, that kind of relieves me a little bit when I think about that. When I was a Christian, I believed that, the Israelites had the monopoly on God. on the true God, the one true God. And they, that was the actual capital T truth, the story that's in Genesis. And looking back on that, it makes me sad that I was so close-minded. Like, I was so dismissive of anything else. If I were to read about a creation myth in a book, let's say a native one, I would have thought, oh, that's cute. That's cute for them. But wouldn't have really given it 2 seconds of thought because I knew the real truth. Yeah. And so anyway, back to stories influencing other stories. So I wrote some notes on the evolution of a myth. And this is from a podcast that will be in the notes. It is called Creation Stories, Landscapes. It's from the book, Creation Stories, Landscapes in the Human Imagination. So this is an example of how a myth has the ability to adapt to cultural change. And again, that's the evolution of a story, evolution of the region that the story is being told in. So it's, the llama in the Andes gives birth to her baby. The llama is the most vital animal of the Andes in their culture. So it's the center of everything. They get their meat, they get the skin from it, they use it for warmth, they use the bones to make tools. So it's similar to the bison and Native Americans. They, wouldn't waste a thing. They used everything. So the llama was most important. So it makes sense that their story would be about that. So this is how the myth goes. It happens that when the llama drinks the water, when she dives into the western horizon after sunset in November, rain comes, timed with the rainy season. The landscape and what happens to the landscape is dependent on the llama story. So we see an example of people creating, developing, being the architect of a story that makes sense for their specific geographical place.
Right.
So the guy explaining this goes into why the story of the llama has legs, as he says, or is adaptable. So the next part of the story, situated next to the llama and her baby, suckling underneath her, is the fox, Atok. That's his name, Atok. And the fox is there crouched, waiting to snatch the baby away from the llama. When the story traveled eastward into tropical rainforest, so in the Amazon basin, the carnivore predator fox becomes a jaguar who chases a tapir. It's like a huge rodent-like animal. And so the tapir is the llama. So they're using their own specific animals that behave in a similar way to the llama and the fox. So as we get down into Argentina, the tapir becomes a deer because there's a lot of forest. So the deer is the prey. And then even farther south, it's the tip of Tierra del Fuego. The predator and the prey switch places. And the predator is the dog. The prey is the South American ostrich. And it explains why. The ostrich's long neck was much like the llama's. So it's so fascinating to me that this story, who knows where it originated from, it had so much adaptability that it could be applied from way far north to as far south as you can get in that longitudinal direction. So I wanted to share that because if we want to discount the possibility of the writers in Genesis being influenced by other cultures and just thinking they got a direct download from God, that is really discounting actual fact, actual telephone game, right? Like that was involved too in these cultures because they were very like oral traditions until people started to write things down or draw pictures of things.
It would mean eliminating natural human behavior, especially for that time frame and that time period.
Correct. Like, and you can't dismiss context.
Right. You have to include context. Otherwise, you don't really understand what's happening because that means it's entirely supernatural and there's been no human influence at all. And that's a matter of faith. I get that. But because of a lot of other reasons, you and I started going down a deep dive in our Christian walk, to include the human factor. And it became more and more obvious that was an enormous influence in Scripture.
Yes.
Ancient Mesopotamia that whole region, civilization, all have enormous overlaps. And if you read them, the actual stories, it can get very confusing and complicated. And so I think that's why we have to generalize with a lot of these creation myths, because they are very, very detailed, and much more to them. So I've left it up to the scholars who study these scriptures to give me synopsises so that I could give you the quick download so that if you are interested, you can go further. But to piggyback on the Enuma Elish that you shared earlier, supposedly the story that I'm going to share, which is Sumerian or Akkadian, fueled your story.
Okay, cool.
The Enuma Elish came as a result of the story that I'm about to share, which there's a lot of conflicting information out there, but supposedly, and a lot of scholars believe that this is the oldest written history that we have in Sumeria, or from Sumeria, which is modern day Iraq. Which, by the way, this culture of that time, it was the first civilization to record history and have a written language and a spoken language. I don't know how they know that. Has the oldest writings on tablet. They're from the 24th century BCE. And they developed the modern calendar, geometry, the wheel, the first plow. Dead Sea Scrolls and the Sumerian tablets have an enormous amount of overlap, which is super interesting to me. So I'm going to give you the gist of the creation myth that came out of this area. Gods emerged from the primordial sea. Anunnaki were the gods tasked with creating humans that would serve them. So there were different types of gods, and the Anunnaki were the ones tasked with creating humans that would serve them. So they created the humans to basically worship them and work for them because they wanted to work less. The goddess Ninhursag created humans from clay and blood. There is a lot of people out there that believe in this creation myth as truth. And when it says clay and blood, they believe that they took some of their DNA as gods and mixed them with humans and made this new human breed. Humans were created to work and worship with the gods. It says in the beginning that they emerged from the primordial sea, but there's actually those gods that emerged from the primordial sea. They weren't the only gods. There were other gods also that came from other planets. And there's actually a planet that's named in this creation myth that they came from. And they came from that planet to look for gold because their atmosphere on their planet was becoming so polluted that they needed to filter out the atmosphere with gold. It was a resource that it supposedly contributed. That Mesopotamian area is where gold got its original value. And so a lot of people speculate that it was because the aliens made it valuable because they wanted it.
That is so imaginative.
It really is. So the aliens that inhabited Earth, they mined for gold, and their planet comes into our solar system every 3,600 years. So they expect the Anunnaki to revisit Earth every 3,600 years, which is super interesting.
Yeah, it is. Are we getting close to that?
I know, right? So that story, if you go on a deep dive into the Anunnaki, I mean, there's more than one Joe Rogan episode dedicated to it. There's countless videos out there about the Anunnaki because there supposedly is a growing number of people that actually believe it is like the Bible. They have faith that it's an actual truth. And super, super interesting. So
is that related? Are those people related to or connected to any type of religion? Or is it more like kind of the concept of flat earthers? Like they just have this one general concept in common that they believe in. Do you know?
You know, if I think it's more like in a religion. But I don't know for sure. That's a really good question. I'd have to look that one up. I don't know. But yeah, there's also the Epic of Gilgamesh came out of that area, which we can go into. There's, we're talking about the creation myths, but it's impossible to not see parallels in other myths, also with what we were raised with in the biblical myths. So yeah, if you're interested in another flood story, which was written before the Bible, the Epic of Gilgamesh is definitely a deep dive worth going down. I mean, literally a flood that destroyed humanity, and God warns a guy and he builds a boat and saves his family and his animals, It's like basically
familiar.
No, it's really crazy. And that was written in Babylonian writings from like 1800 BCE. And these numbers there's always a range, whenever I'm looking up how old is, this story or that story. And it depends on what you mean by whether or not you're talking about the oral or the written. It's always a huge range these myths come from. So I'd like to give the similarities and differences. Actually, first, before we move on to that, did you have any other thoughts about the anything we talked about so far?
So yeah, what I'm finding is that all of these different people groups, cultures in various geographical locations are using these stories to make sense of the landscape around them. And I don't just mean are there mountains or are there valleys landscape. I mean the entirety of their situation. If they live in an arid place, if they live in a really rainy place, if they live on an island, if they live where there's snow the vast majority of their lives. So it makes sense that these stories are reflective of that physical environment that they're in. And I think it's also another piece of the puzzle coming from a Christian or former Christian point of view to realize that this ancient stories that we find in Genesis, it's not 100% applicable to where we live today. Mm-hmm. We live geographically in a different place. Our cultures are completely different. It just doesn't make sense to do a one-to-one transfer of believing that, because they were making sense of their surroundings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love it. I want to also make note that after the flood, the Anunnaki that I was speaking about earlier reestablished order and created new humans after the flood. And that's where your story of the what is it?
Enuma Elish.
Enuma Elish. That is where this supposedly the city of Babylon was established, and that creation story came as a result. So like there's do-overs.
Yeah, basically, that's so interesting.
That the Anunnaki did. Like they didn't really like the first round of humans they created. And that's not just the Anunnaki. There's other creation stories that talk about a similar type vibe where the first try didn't work. So let's just wipe it out with the flood and start all over, Super interesting.
It really is.
So talking about those similarities, a lot of what I saw, and please tell me if I leave anything out, the primordial sea and chaos is huge. I mean, like nothingness, right? Mm-hmm. Is a big part of a lot of these stories at the beginning. Nature, heaven and earth, garden, a paradise. Oh my gosh, it was so cool. I found one story from it was, I think, Papua New Guinea, that where there were humans that lived in a paradise garden. Now, Papua New Guinea's story was mostly oral, and of course they were colonized, so there may have been some influence there, but the creation story that I found at least had a Garden of Eden basically in it. Super interesting.
That is really interesting. I bet though colonization, I mean, unless it was recently rewritten across, all sources, I bet that was just part of their story before colonization.
I would hope so.
Because that would have to be pretty recent if it's based off the colonization.
Yeah, it was definitely Englishmen that visited the Papua New Guinea in the early 1900s that took note of their stories. So I don't know how much white man influence had happened by the time they actually got written down. That was the hard part with some of these creation myths, is that they were predominantly oral until someone who was willing to write it down wrote it down. That's what makes the Mesopotamian creation stories so beautifully unique, is they actually still have tablets that are thousands of years old that tell these stories, which is just, and I mean, if you ever look at a picture of the tablets and the writing that's actually used on them, I don't know how they do it. Like, it's kind of like reading Chinese, to me. Like it just looks like a code.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't even know where to begin knowing how to read it.
I have a quick
anyway.
little tidbit about that. So it's actually cuneiform is what they wrote on these clay tablets. And that's why we have the stories preserved, because they used clay. They didn't use papyrus or anything that's super perishable. So I love that. I love that it was preserved because of the resource they were using. And the cool thing about deciphering that like weird, it does look like a code. It's like a lot of triangles and stuff. It's very interesting. They had 4 different linguistic scholars, maybe, I don't know, but they were like specialized in translation or figuring out, kind of decoding like a written form like this. And so 4 people individually looked at these texts, these clay tablets, and did their best with what they knew about maybe written things in the surrounding areas. And they all submitted their best deciphered translation to, I don't know, some like scholarly university or something. I don't remember the specific details, but they all submitted it. And the board or whatever that they submitted it to decided that there was enough overlap between those 4 different interpretations of the text that they figured out the language.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. It's like, oh my gosh, I don't even know how humans do that. That is incredible. So
it really is.
Yeah, like I thought that was a really interesting, just kind of little detail about the deciphering of it.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I love hearing that. That's just so stinking cool to me. So some of the other similarities that I saw would have been good versus evil, light versus dark, or not versus, but light and dark. There being a contrast there. Creating humans from clay. There being divine rest as well. Like the gods need to rest, or they assign rest to the humans. And they're serpent, cosmic trees, sacred geographical locations, and creation through speech is really common. Like, sometimes it'll be like man was made from the tears of this god, or the animals were made from the hair of this god, things like that. But there's more times than those I hear things like, and they spoke it and it was. So that was interesting. Other myths with similarities, there's a lot of flood myths out there. If you haven't already looked into it, that's a whole nother podcast series. And I
think we should touch on that in the next one, just to give kind of a brief overview.
Yeah, for sure. The flood is in a lot of these stories do-overs for the culture. There's Christ-like figures, sacrifice, worship, divine love, virgin and divine births, resurrection from death, redemption from evil, miracles. These are all themes or motifs, as they call them, that just are all over the place with these myths. Some of the biggest major differences that I saw in all the myths that I read was polytheism versus monotheism.
I was literally just going to say that if you didn't.
Yeah. And then the relationship with nature, there's more of an emphasis on that with some stories versus a relationship with the gods or God. And then more goddesses.
Yeah.
Those are the 3 biggest contrasts that I see, or major differences that I see in a lot of these stories. Obviously, there's a lot more than that, but those are the major ones. Gosh, we could literally go on and on about everything we learned. It's been such a fun research for me. I took notes. We've spent a lot more time on studying this, and I don't know if it's shown in what we're sharing, but because I feel like we're just scratching the surface.
Yeah, barely, even at that. It was honestly, and Anna can corroborate this story, I was feeling so overwhelmed. I didn't even start till 2 days before doing the podcast because I was like, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to start. This is so much bigger than what my brain can handle. But I guess I just listened to my gut and followed the stories that really resonated with me, like the few that I was aware of. And then, one thing begets another. And so it actually was a really easy ride to get onto once I started. But man, it is vast. It's expansive. It is as interesting and unique as every single person, all these creation stories. And it makes sense because these are just humans like you, like Anna, like myself, trying to make sense of their place in this world. That is what the creation myth is all about, trying to figure out, why am I here? How am I here? Where do I fit in the grand scheme of this landscape that I find myself in?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been remarkable. And I look forward to part 2, where we'll delve into some various other topics that are adjacent to creation myths. I'm looking forward to it. It's gonna be fun.
Yeah, I do too. Thanks for joining me and Carrie Jo today with the Heretical Hippies podcast. And we'd love to hear back from you. Please let us know who you are and talk to us.
Yeah.
Love you guys.
Love you. See you guys later. As always,
peace out,
motherfuckers. We should have learned that in a different language. Hey, if you made it this far, damn, you're a rock star. Thank you so much for listening to us, and let us know who you are. We want to hear from your sweet little face. Check back in for the next episode to experience more hippie nonsense, talk more heresy, and share more laughs.